Abigail Ellington's apple pie was halfway to the trash bin when the rancher's hand closed around the tin under the warm glow of the Christmas fair. Lanterns strung across Silverbrush Crossing danced in the winter wind, scattering gold light over wreaths of pine and tables crowded with holiday sweets. But at the dessert stall, where Abigail stood, the cheer soured into something colder than the snow outside. "Leave it," a woman snapped, her grip tightening on the pie dish. "No one wants that." Laughter rippled through the fair hall, brushing against Abigail like sleet cutting skin, her pie gold-crusted, brushed with sugar. Carrying the scent of baked apples and cinnamon sat untouched among towering cakes and sugared cookies. For a moment, she could almost hear her father saying, a Christmas pie carried enough warmth to soften any heart. Tonight, nothing softened. I said, "No one wants it," the woman hissed, lifting the tin toward the bin. A man's voice broke through the noise, deep and steady. "I do," he said. "It tastes like home." Winter in Silverbrush Crossing carried a voice of its own, a low, restless hum rolling down from the Wyoming mountains and slipping through every crack in the wooden town. It rattled the pine wreaths tacked above the storefronts, shivered against window glass, and swept long trails of snow across the dirt road like white ribbons curling at the mercy of the wind. Outside, the world smelled of cold bark, smoke, and distant cattle. Inside the Christmas fair hall, warmth pressed against the chill lantern glow, cinnamon, and the soft murmur of neighbors exchanging the same stories they told every winter. Abigail Ellington stood near the dessert tables, positioned as though she hoped the juniper garlands behind her might let her disappear into the wall. Her shawl hung heavy across her shoulders, its wool scratching her neck each time she shifted. Lantern light washed over her, softening the deep brown of her hair and catching the faint flush on her cheeks, a color caused as much by nerves as by the frigid walk from home. She carried a soft, full figure shaped not by idleness, but by a life spent in warm kitchens. Abigail had the rounded curves of someone who'd been raised over stoves and mixing bowls, arms gently pillowed from kneading dough, hips that filled out her simple winter dress, shoulders that sloped under the weight of years trying to be smaller than she was. Her face, sweetly round as a rising loaf, held cheeks that flushed a tender rose when she was embarrassed. Strands of chestnut hair slipped loose from the pins securing her bun, falling around her temples in warm strokes against the cold air of the hall. But it was her eyes large, soft, brown that gave her away. They held the gentleness of someone who had survived far more cruelty than she'd ever spoken aloud. Some evenings they dimmed, retreating behind lowered lashes as if she could fold herself inward. Other times, when she allowed herself the smallest smile, they glowed with a warmth no hearth could imitate. Her father had once told her she was steady as sourdough, a phrase only bakers used, and one that lingered in her memory like the scent of apples and flour. She tightened her fingers around the edge of her shawl, listening to the fair's sounds swell around her. Children darted between tables, chasing one another through strands of pine garland. Merchants barked out last-minute offers for candied nuts and winter spices. A fiddler tuned his instrument near the corner where the dancers would gather by nightfall. Silverbrush Crossing was not a large town, but on Christmas week, it felt like the whole valley had squeezed itself inside these walls. Still, Abigail had never felt more alone. She steadied her breath, forcing herself to look anywhere except at the cluster of women who had laughed earlier. Her gaze drifted across the hall, catching on the open doorway where a gust of wind carried in a swirl of snow and a man stepping in from the cold. Vance Holloway brushed the frost from his coat sleeve as he crossed the threshold. Boots thudding on the wooden floor. Snow clung to the hem of his coat and glittered across his hat brim like flecks of shattered starlight. He paused just long enough for the warmth of the hall to meet the cold on his skin, then moved forward with the calm assurance of someone who knew how to take the measure of a room in a single breath. People said many things about him, that he was the youngest of 5 brothers and the only one stubborn enough to carve out a ranch of his own, that he'd fought off 2 rustlers alone one winter, that he carried a scar along his jaw thin, pale, shaped by a fight no one would speak of. Rumors bent with the wind, but the quiet strength in his stride was undeniable. His gaze swept the room once, no more. When it brushed past Abigail, she felt it like the briefest touch against her skin. She looked away quickly, heat rising under her scarf, unsure why a stranger's presence should pull her breath taut. She didn't know him beyond the stories told in saloons, didn't expect to cross paths with him tonight, didn't imagine his arrival had anything to do with her. But something in Silverbrush Crossing shifted, then subtle as the settling of snow on a rooftop. Easy to miss unless you happen to be standing still. And Abigail, hands trembling near her cooling pie, felt the first flicker of a change she could not yet name. The room had not yet recovered from its murmurs when Vance Holloway reached the dessert table. The Christmas fair hummed behind him, laughter, fiddle strings, the thump of boots, but the space around Abigail felt strangely hushed, as though the air itself was waiting to see what he would do. He didn't look at the women clustered nearby, nor at the half-circle of onlookers who had gathered with the eager anticipation of a crowd sensing humiliation. His attention settled instead on the pie tin Abigail held, pressed protectively against her apron. The crust was cracked where tension had shaken her hands. Sugar dust still clung to her sleeves. The faint scent of apples and warm spice drifted upward, an echo of a memory that had caught him off guard last night, the memory of his mother's kitchen before the world had hardened him. He nodded toward the tin. "May I?" Abigail almost didn't hear him. Her ears still rang with the sharp words that had come only moments earlier. She hesitated, breath trembling, unsure if this was another performance meant to entertain the crowd at her expense. Her fingers tightened around the dish, half reflex, half fear. Vance waited. He didn't reach for it, didn't push. His stance was calm, patient, as though the room around them wasn't thick with judgment. Abigail slowly extended the pie toward him. He took a knife from the table, cut a small corner, and lifted the bite to his mouth. The room fell still again. Every whisper pinched off mid-sentence. Even the fiddler paused with his bow hovering above the strings. Vance tasted the pie the way someone tastes something important, not quickly, not with the polite smile of a man pretending to appreciate a stranger's dish, but with stillness, with recognition. He closed his eyes. The crowd shifted, confused. Abigail held her breath. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the clarity of truth rather than performance. "You made this," Abigail swallowed. "Yes." His eyes opened, steady and dark. "It tastes like home." A few women scoffed. Someone muttered that he was being kind. Another suggested he had no palate at all. But Vance didn't look away from Abigail. "Who taught you?" he asked quietly, as though the answer mattered to him and him alone. She wet her lips. "My father." He nodded once, almost reverently. His next words were softer still, meant only for her despite the crowd leaning in to listen. He taught you well. Something warm flickered in Abigail's chest light, fragile, unexpected, as if a draft had slipped under a door and touched a room long closed off. Behind her, the woman who'd tried to take the pie let out a sharp breath, offended that her moment of triumph had slipped away. Really? Mr. Holloway, she snapped. There's no need to... Vance didn't let her finish. He cut another bite of pie, slower this time, then looked at Abigail again. I'm telling the truth, he said. This is good. Abigail wasn't used to hearing praise, especially not from a man like him. A man whose approval seemed to ripple through the crowd like a shift in the wind. She felt suddenly exposed, as though he had peeled back every layer she used to keep herself invisible. Her voice barely came out. Thank you. Vance nodded and stepped back, letting the noise of the hall rush in again. But before he turned away completely, he added, You shouldn't hide this, or yourself. Then he walked on, giving her space rather than claiming it, leaving her with a pie tin she suddenly saw in a different light, and a warmth in her chest that didn't feel entirely like embarrassment. It felt like something beginning. Christmas morning broke pale and unforgiving across Silverbrush Crossing. Frost clung to every window pane, whitening the edges of the town like breath from a weary giant. Abigail Ellington sat up slowly in her small bed, still wrapped in the dull ache of last night's humiliation. Her eyes were swollen, her throat dry, but she carried a quiet determination to make the morning pass without provoking her stepmother. Henrietta Ellington did not allow her that mercy. The door burst open with a force that startled the cold air. Henrietta stood framed in the doorway, fully dressed, her face set with such rigid disgust that Abigail felt it before she heard the words. Pack your things. Abigail blinked. It's Christmas. You ruined Christmas. Henrietta stepped into the room, arms crossed. You embarrassed me, embarrassed this household, and made a spectacle of yourself with that ridiculous pie. Her voice sharpened. You have 1 hour. Anything you don't take. I burn. The words hit Abigail like stones. She had expected anger, but not exile, not on this morning. Her breath fluttered out in a small, wounded sound before she caught it. Where am I supposed to go? She asked quietly. Henrietta's expression didn't shift. You're 24. Figure it out. And just like that, the last fragile thread tying Abigail to the house she grew up in snapped. An hour later, she walked into the winter street, clutching a canvas bag no heavier than her grief. Her father's recipe book and tin box were tucked safely inside, the only pieces of him she had left. Everything else Henrietta had claimed. The cold bit at Abigail's skin as she stepped into the empty street. Chimneys smoked. Families gathered behind closed doors. Laughter echoed faintly from warm homes she would never enter. Abigail stood in the middle of the road, the world stripped bare around her, and let a single thought press into her ribs. She had nowhere. Her steps carried her instinctively toward town, though she had no plan except to keep moving. Snow crunched beneath her boots, her breath rising in small clouds. She hugged the canvas bag closer, trying to protect the little she had left from the wind. Miss Ellington. She turned. Vance Holloway sat atop a dark bay horse, its mane dusted with frost. He guided the animal closer, stopping just a few feet from her. His brows drew together as he took in the bag. The thinness of her shawl, the red rims around her eyes. "What happened?" he asked, his voice low. Abigail swallowed, embarrassed to be seen like this. "My stepmother asked me to leave. On Christmas." His jaw tightened. "She threw you out." Abigail nodded. Words tangled in her throat. She hated that he saw her this way, small, shaken, carrying everything she owned in a bag. But Vance didn't look at her with pity. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her pie, as something worth understanding. He took a slow breath, as though weighing a decision only he could make. "My ranch is 3 miles west," he said finally. "There's a guest cabin, small but warm, and empty." Abigail blinked. "I can't impose." "You wouldn't be," he said gently. "I have 6 ranch hands who burn every meal they touch. You could cook, room and board in exchange for feeding us." He held her gaze. "Fair work, fair pay, nothing improper." Abigail's heart thumped unevenly. She stared at him, searching for mockery or hidden motives, but found none. Only steadiness. Only a man offering her the one thing Silverbrush Crossing never had a choice. "Why?" she whispered. A breath of frost escaped his lips. "Because no one deserves to be left standing in the cold." His voice dipped, soft. "And because of your pie last night, it reminded me of home." The words sank deep, warming a place inside her that had been cold for far too long. She nodded, tiny but sure. Vance reached down, offering her his hand. She took it. He pulled her up behind him, settled her bag securely, and guided the horse toward the open valley. As they left town, Abigail glanced back once at the house she'd never belonged to, at the life she was finally slipping free from. Then she faced forward, toward the mountains where the horizon opened wide. Vance's ranch sat on a gentle rise overlooking the plains. The land stretched in all directions, pale gold beneath the winter sky. A cluster of wooden buildings huddled close together: the barn, the main house, a bunkhouse, and a small cabin near the cottonwoods. Smoke curled from the chimney of the main house, carrying the scent of cedar logs. "This one's yours," Vance said, opening the cabin door for her. The room inside was simple: a narrow bed, a stove, a table, a single window framing the snow-dusted pasture. But it was warm, a warmth earned, not granted. Abigail stepped in, her chest tightening with something she hadn't felt in years: safety. "You'll cook in the main house," Vance said quietly. "My men eat at dawn, noon, and sunset. Sunday's off. We'll get you proper clothes for the cold." "Thank you," she managed. He hesitated at the doorway, then added softly, "Your pie, the crust, the spice, the way the apples were cut. It tasted like something I thought I'd lost. You should know that." Then he left her alone in a room that already felt more like a home than the house she'd lived in all her life. Days passed, and Abigail fell into a rhythm she never expected to find. She woke before the sun, lit the stove, and filled the kitchen with warmth. She made biscuits so tender the men joked she was ruining them for every cook that came after. She learned the ranch hands' names: Tom, Marcus, James, and their quiet ways of showing gratitude: chopped wood left at her cabin door, a repaired hinge on her window, a mended glove. Vance lingered in the kitchen more often than was necessary. He'd lean against the doorframe, arms crossed, listening as she spoke about spices or asked about the horses. He moved with the quiet authority of a man who didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. When their eyes met, something unspoken hung between them, faint, warm, impossible to name. One morning, he caught her struggling to crack ice on the water barrel. Without a word, he took the hammer from her hands and broke it with one swift blow. She looked up at him, surprised by how close he stood. He stepped back immediately, as if afraid to crowd her. Another afternoon, he offered to teach her to ride. She sat stiffly in the saddle, clutching the pommel, breath held tight. "You're safe," he murmured from behind her as he placed his hands over hers on the reins. His breath warmed the shell of her ear. "I've got you." And she believed him. Each day knit them closer, threads pulled tight by small acts, his patience, her laughter, his silence, her courage. Neither spoke of what was growing between them. Both felt it, and neither understood yet how easily one voice from the past could shatter it. Winter settled deeper over the valley, pressing a pale silence across Vance Holloway's ranch. Abigail had begun to recognize its rhythms, the crunch of hooves in snow at dawn, the thump of logs being split near the barn, the quiet comfort of the stove glowing in the main house. She didn't belong here, not truly. Yet each day she felt herself slipping quietly, gratefully, into the life that opened around her like a warm quilt. On the 5th morning since she arrived, Abigail carried a basket of peeled apples toward the cottonwoods behind the bunkhouse. She liked working there, where the sunlight fell soft through the branches and the wind smelled of cold sap. She was slicing the apples into thin, practiced crescents when the sound of wagon wheels broke the stillness, the churn of snow beneath iron rims, the stiff clatter of a harness, the unmistakable rhythm of a woman who believed the world opened before her simply because she demanded it. Henrietta Ellington. Abigail froze. Her knife trembled in midair. The wagon rolled into the yard, its red wheels cutting harsh lines into the snow. Henrietta climbed down, wrapped in velvet, darker than the winter sky. Her chin lifted as if the air offended her. The ranch hands paused their work. Marcus straightened from hauling hay. James stepped off the porch, uncertain whether to greet her or to flee. Vance emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a cloth. His eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly when he saw the visitor. "Mrs. Ellington," he said, voice polite but cool. Henrietta ignored the greeting, her eyes locked onto Abigail like a hawk sighting weak prey. "So here you are," Henrietta said, her voice carrying clear and sharp across the open yard. "I wondered how long it would take you to attach yourself to someone else." Abigail's breath hitched. She set the apple knife down, fingers shaking, and stepped back as though the snow under her boots had turned to ice. Vance walked closer. "If you're here to cause trouble—" Henrietta cut him off with a cold smile. "Mr. Holloway, I am here for my stepdaughter. She seems to think she can run away from her responsibilities." Abigail flinched. Responsibilities. That word had beaten her into silence for years. Vance's jaw flexed. "She doesn't owe you anything." "Oh, doesn't she?" Henrietta turned her attention back to Abigail, her voice dripping with poison. "I suppose you think living under this man's roof makes you someone new, someone wanted." Her gaze raked Abigail from her boots to her rounded cheeks, lingering with cruelty. "But men like him, They enjoy novelty for a while, and then they get bored. Abigail felt something crack open inside her, a familiar voice her own. From years of listening to Henrietta whispered with icy certainty, "She's right. Why would someone like him want someone like you?" Vance took a step forward. But Henrietta wasn't finished. "Do you really believe he's honest with you?" she said, voice rising. "A woman like you. He'll tire of you, Abigail. Men always do. Your father did. The town already has. And soon enough, he will too." The words struck like blows. Abigail's breath came thin and shallow. Her vision blurred not from tears, but from the old instinct to shrink, to disappear, to become small enough not to be mocked. She stumbled back, nearly tipping the basket. Abigail Vance's voice reached out, steady and warm, but she couldn't hear it. Not through the flood of memories and shame, not through the sound of Henrietta's voice weaving itself into the old, raw wounds she had never healed. "I shouldn't have come here," Abigail whispered. "I shouldn't be here at all." She turned and ran away from Henrietta's gaze, away from the men staring in stunned silence, away from the faint hope she'd begun to let herself believe in. She headed toward the cottonwoods, her breath breaking in the frigid air. Vance took one look at the despair in her retreating figure and felt something inside him snap. He turned on Henrietta. "You should leave," he said quietly. Too quietly. Henrietta scoffed. "I will not be spoken to. You've done enough harm for one lifetime." His voice remained low, but it carried the weight of a storm rolling off the mountains. "You may not know it, but that woman is stronger than anything you've ever been. And you tried to break her." Henrietta stiffened. "She is my responsibility." "No," Vance said. "She was your burden. And you made sure she knew it every day." Henrietta's eyes flashed with fury. "You think you understand her? You think she's your project now? A man like you, a man like me," Vance said, stepping closer, "knows exactly what it feels like to be dismissed, overlooked, belittled. I've had 4 brothers and a whole town try to do it." His eyes burned. "But I won't let you do it to her. Not again." Henrietta faltered for the first time. Vance didn't watch her reaction. He turned and strode toward the cottonwoods. The snow grew deeper beneath his boots as he followed the path Abigail had taken. The bare branches whispered above him, bending with the wind. At the base of the largest cottonwood, he found her. She sat in the snow, arms wrapped around herself, her breath shaking like a child's in the cold. Her shawl had slipped off her shoulder. Her hair was loose. Her eyes were wide and glazed, as though she were staring into a past only she could see. Vance slowed, kneeling in front of her. He didn't touch her. Not yet. "Abigail," he said quietly. She shook her head. "She's right. I don't belong anywhere. I never have." Vance reached out then, gently lifting her chin with the back of 2 fingers. Her eyes met his, full of hurt, full of resignation. "Don't let her lie to you," he said. "Not about you. Not about me." Her lip trembled. "Why would you care?" "Because I do." His voice thickened, honesty roughening it like gravel. "Because when I tasted your pie, I remembered something I thought I'd lost. Because when you smiled in my kitchen, I felt my house change." He swallowed. "Because you matter to me." Abigail's breath caught. The cold wind pressed around them, but neither moved. Vance leaned closer, his forehead almost touching hers. "She thinks I'll tire of you," he said softly. "But the truth is, Abigail Ellington, I've been searching for you longer than you know." A tear slipped down her cheek, not from sorrow now, but from something warmer, something almost too tender to name. Vance brushed it away with his thumb, and for the first time, she let herself believe him. Vance didn't rush her. He stayed kneeling in the snow until her breathing slowed, until the trembling in her hands eased enough for her fingers to unclench from the fabric of her skirt. When Abigail finally looked up, the rawness in her gaze nearly undid him anger he could have fought, sorrow he could have carried for her. But this quiet, exhausted doubt was the thing he wanted most to protect her from. "Let's get you out of the cold," he murmured. She nodded, small and slow. He wrapped her shawl back around her shoulders and helped her stand, guiding her toward her cabin with a gentleness that belied the fury still simmering in his chest. Snow whispered beneath their boots. The wind tugged at Abigail's skirt, but Vance's hand at her elbow steadied her with every step. Once inside, he lit the stove with practiced movements, shoving cedar logs into the iron belly until fire bloomed and warmth spilled across the small room. Abigail stood near the table, arms wrapped tight around herself, as though unsure whether she was truly safe. "You don't have to talk yet," Vance said, crouching by the stove. "Just warm up." She nodded again, but the words pressed at her anyway, fragile and unsteady. "I thought I was past letting her hurt me." Her voice wavered. "I thought maybe I was becoming someone different here." "You are," he said instantly. "But healing doesn't erase scars. It doesn't stop them from aching." She lowered herself onto the chair. The fire crackled, filling the silence with soft pops. Abigail stared at her hands round, flower-worn, trembling as if seeing them from a distance. "She said you'd get bored," she whispered. Vance turned fully toward her. "Abigail, I know what I look like," she said, voice tightening. "I know what people think. I know what she thinks. And sometimes I believe her more than I should." Her breath caught again. "Why would someone like you care about someone like me?" The question struck him clean through. For years, Vance had been the afterthought in his own family, the youngest who had to shout to be heard. But no one, not one of his brothers, not even the woman who'd once broken his heart, had ever made him feel so fiercely protective as Abigail did now. He stepped closer, slowly, until he stood directly before her. "Look at me." She hesitated, then lifted her eyes. "I don't care about you, despite who you are," he said. "I care about you because of who you are, because you're kind in a world that doesn't deserve you, because you bake the way some people pray like it's the only thing keeping them alive, because you laugh softly, but it changes a whole room." His voice lowered. "And because I see you trying every day to make yourself small when you have every right to take up space." Abigail didn't speak. Her breath trembled in her chest. He crouched in front of her, placing his hands gently over hers. "I've lived alone on this ranch for years, Abby, and I've never once walked into my house and felt home. Not until you stood in my kitchen. Not until you smiled at me over a bowl of batter and said it needed more spice." A tear slipped down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. "You matter to me," Vance said, "more than you know." She exhaled shakily, a sound halfway between a sob and relief. I don't want to be someone you pity. You're not, he said. You're someone I choose. Those words broke something open, something she'd kept locked behind years of shame and whispered cruelty. She leaned forward without thinking, her forehead pressing against his. Vance's hands came up instinctively to cradle her face, his thumb brushing lingering traces of tears. I'm scared, she breathed. So am I, he answered softly. But I'm not leaving. A long, trembling quiet settled between them, as gentle and fragile as new snow. Then Abigail whispered, Vance, yeah, stay with me a while. He didn't hesitate. He pulled a chair closer, sat beside her, and took her hand in his, letting the warmth of the stove and the slow easing of her breath knit the broken pieces of the moment back together. Outside, the Wyoming wind howled across the plains. Inside the little cabin, for the first time since her father died. Abigail didn't feel alone. Spring settled softly over Silverbrush Crossing, carrying the smell of thawed earth and new grass into the Holloway ranch. In the main house kitchen, warmth lived all year. Abigail Ellington moved with practiced ease, sliding an apple pie from the oven as sunlight spilled across the counter. 6 months ago, she'd arrived here cold and unwanted. Now her hands worked with quiet confidence, shaping the kitchen into a place that felt unmistakably like home. Beside her stood Mary, a thin, frightened girl the ranch had taken in weeks earlier. Abigail guided her gently, showing her how to slice the apples, how to fold the dough without fear. The girl watched her with the same tentative hope Abigail once carried. You're doing well, Abigail assured her. Vance appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame with a softness he reserved only for her. His eyes warmed at the sight of the two women working side by side. You've changed this place, he said. Abigail shook her head slightly. We changed it together. He crossed the room, slipping an arm around her waist. She leaned into him, no hesitation left. You know, he murmured, your apple pie still tastes like home. Abigail smiled, gentle and full. That's because you are home. Vance Holloway. And with that, the kitchen, once cold and unused, became a place where new beginnings rose as surely as any pie in her oven.